Welcome to Mapping the Self. I'm Selena Garofino. Know thyself was carved into stone at the entrance of Apollo's temple at Delphi in ancient Greece. Scholars, poets, philosophers have debated the big questions around what it is to know yourself for thousands of years. I invite you to join me for conversations with artists, creators, scholars, spiritual teachers, writers, and humans of all walks of life to discuss these big questions together, to engage in a dialogue around what it is to live fully, to map ourselves, to know ourselves, to grow our compassion and listening, and to explore together our highest possibilities. Welcome. Welcome back to Mapping the Self. I am so honored today to have Lissa Rankin. She is a medical doctor, a mind-body medicine physician, the author of 7 books. That's no small feat. Founder of the Whole Health Medicine Institute, and a mystic who researches radical remission, trauma-informed medicine, and spiritual healing. Her TEDx talks have been viewed over 5 million times, and she starred in 2 national public television specials, Heal Yourself, Mind Over Medicine, and The Fear Cure. Lissa's interest in the link between loneliness and disease led her to spearhead her latest project, Heal It Last, a nonprofit organization which aims to bring effective trauma healing and spiritual healing methods to anyone ready for the deep dive of healing. I decided it was best just to read your bio. It's so well written. Welcome.
Thank you. Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So I just finished your latest book. I read her earlier book, if you're unaware, Mind Over Medicine, was really powerful. It was a New York Times bestseller, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah, amazing book. And your newest book is incredible. I just finished it, but now I need to go back and do all the exercises in it. I'm someone who likes to read the whole thing and then go back through piece by piece and work through the material.
Same thing. Yeah, I like to sort of bring in the cognitive pieces and then go back and digest it all.
Exactly. So that's what I'm intending to do with your book. I would love it if you would share with our audience, since the book is so new, just a little bit about what the purpose of the book is and who it's for, and just whatever is on your heart to share about the book.
Yeah, well, the book, the original version of this book was 250,000 words, which is 3 books worth of words. And so I had to make a lot of editorial decisions, and I really decided I wanted to write a clinically relevant book for anybody who has tried everything in conventional medicine and maybe has even tried everything that they know to try in the sort of wellness world of, diet and exercise and yoga and alternative medicine. What else? Is there anything else? Because there are so many tools that I was being exposed to that were definitely not taught to me in medical school. And then I also got exposed to kind of the new age wellness world. And I was like, wow, these tools aren't over there either. And so that was my intention, was sort of anybody with a chronic illness who has not been able to find a cure, or somebody facing a terminal illness who is wanting to make sure that they know all of their options. So in no way am I saying don't use those other tools, but these are sort of potentially additional tools that people might not have tried. And so that ultimately was sort of the audience that I was writing this for. And the reason I wrote it, it's really the sequel to Mind Over Medicine. I finished the first draft of Mind Over Medicine in 2011. So that was a long time ago. And the original outline for Mind Over Medicine was that part 1 was going to be everything that we can prove with, medical journals and science about the other things that lead to healing, or the other things that might predispose someone to disease, like the link between loneliness and disease, for example, or the link between creativity and disease remissions, or, the placebo effect and the nocebo effect, and the impact of the consciousness of the healer on the person in need of healing, for example. And so I was looking at all the science. And then part 2 was going to be sort of all of the things that science doesn't quite know how to handle, because, the evidence-based medicine scientific method is dependent on being able to quantify and objectify things. And what do you do with all those things in the realm of healing that are more in the subjective aspects of healing, like including anecdotes of radical remission or sort of these miracle stories? And things like how do you possibly parse out the healing presence of the person delivering whatever medicine or delivering whatever trauma therapy or delivering whatever energy healing from the actual method itself. And I think that goes for pills and surgeries as well. Like, I don't think it's an accident that some people, I got actually kicked out of pharmaceutical trials for having my placebo effect be too high. And when I tried to make sense of that, I think it was just that people respond to a loving, compassionate, in the IFS, internal family systems world, self-led presence in ways that might have nothing to do with the drug. And I wanted to write a book that included some of those subjective aspects of healings. And the original version of Mind Over Medicine got too unwieldy. So I decided to separate that out and make it a second book. I got the title before I got any of the content of Sacred Medicine. And I decided, okay, if I'm going to write a book about the subjective aspects of healing, I want to do this right. And that's going to take, I had a young child at the time. That's going to take me years of being able to just take time away here and there from mothering in order to go to work with shamans in Peru and Qigong masters from China and Balinese healers and faith healers and energy healers and going to pilgrimage sites like Lourdes and trying to figure out what is knowable and what is controllable, as opposed to the things that will continue to remain a mystery and that are maybe entirely outside of our control, in order to bring to the public whatever, all the tools that I could find that I thought, well, if you haven't tried this, this might be the thing that could make you miracle prone if you haven't tried it yet.
Thank you. That was a really beautiful explanation. For our listener, I think it's important to distinguish between healing and curing, so they know what we're speaking about. So do you want to speak on that for a moment for the listener?
Well, sure. I mean, in conventional medicine, when we talk about cure, we're typically talking about no evidence of disease, meaning, laboratory testing, radiology studies, physical exam, from all testing perspectives, the disease is gone, you are now cured. Obviously with things like cancer, we would say you're in remission, right? So maybe it'll come back. But at some point, if there hasn't been a remission, then we say, okay, there's a cure. That is very different than healing, which at the Latin roots of the words healing is holism, right? To heal is to become whole. And when I think of that, I think of it sort of in shamanic terms, where in the shamanic traditions, they talk about parts of our soul that get sort of fragmented off, or in the trauma healing world, like internal family systems, they might be parts of us that get stuck in the past or get exiled from the wholeness of our being. And so to become whole is to sort of have these soul retrievals, or being able to go back in time to retrieve these parts that might be exiled and bring them back into our energy field, our body, our awareness, and to be able to kind of have in IFS, we call it self-leadership, like the divine self. I call it your inner pilot light. You might call it Christ consciousness or Buddha nature. In IFS, we call it self with a capital S. Like to have the wise self caring for the wounded parts of us and bringing those parts all into the system together in a synchronized way, as opposed to having them fragmented or stuck in the past. And so when we can have healing without cure. And I think any of us who have ever been present at a beautiful death have been able to witness what it's like when somebody sort of is completing a life well lived, or maybe it was a life not so well lived, but they've been able to have repair and restoration of wholeness and forgive themselves and be forgiven by people that they've hurt in the family, maybe, to be able to sort of come to a state of completion, of feeling like, oh, I am healed even though I'm not cured, and I'm prepared to transition out of this life in this beautiful way. And I am like a big fan of hospice. I was lucky to lose both of my parents in hospice. And I think hospice is often a beautiful facilitator for healing without curing, where people are transitioning out and, there's no more treatments left. And maybe they've even tried everything in sacred medicine. I tell people this is specifically beautiful work for anybody in hospice. And sometimes people get kicked out of hospice. Like, some people actually do their healing work not until end of life. Yeah. And, sometimes mysteriously those terminal conditions turn around and they get kicked out of hospice because they haven't died 5 years later,
Right.
And that's very different. But when I think about healing, I think that it will always benefit you to do the work of healing, whether or not you get a cure. But more, when we do that healing work, we are definitely putting ourselves in a state of receptivity and potential for a greater potential outcome, to make yourself, in the book, I call it making yourself miracle prone. And it's never a guarantee. And I always like to say that because, I never want to give false hope, but I think there's real hope when we do the work of healing, especially if we're doing kind of that deep dive of trauma healing, of those things that we may not have touched and that conventional medicine rarely touches. If you cut out somebody's tumor or give them chemotherapy or radiation, you're not necessarily touching their trauma. You're not addressing at all what happened. And I'm especially thinking of people who are young, because obviously at some point, if you're 90 and your body starts to break down, that's normal. Yeah. None of us are eternal beings in body, and our bodies will break down at some point from aging, and we will leave our bodies, and that's normal. Yeah. But especially if people are younger, if it's before their time, potentially, what happened to make that body vulnerable? What happened that maybe, because we all make cancer cells every day, we're all exposed to infectious diseases, we have proteins that break down, we have things that happen to the body, and the body is naturally equipped to repair those things. So if disease overtakes the body, and again, not all diseases are related to psychospiritual or nervous system conditions. It could be that somebody lives next to a toxic waste dump, or they're born with 2 copies of a recessive gene that gives them cystic fibrosis. But those things aside, the majority of chronic illnesses or lifestyle illnesses or stress-related or trauma-related illnesses, and we have very, very good data now, just solid data looking at adverse childhood experiences and pretty clear linkages between heavy loads of trauma and early onset disease and decreased longevity over long-term scientific studies. And so, I think the important question to ask, and part of the sort of holy grail of what I found in this research, was asking the question of what happened to this body? What happened to put this body into a chronic nervous system dysregulation, such that there's immune system dysfunction that impacts the endocrine system, can also impact the microbiome, and can lead to chronic inflammation. And the link between chronic inflammation and trauma is pretty solid at this point. And the link between chronic inflammation and almost every disease, as the sort of underpinning of almost every disease, including COVID, is pretty solid at this point. And so anything that we can do to create chronically settled nervous systems that are in, for those of your listeners who are familiar with polyvagal theory, this is the sort of ventral vagal part of the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and relax and restore in connection, in community, that sort of social aspect of the parasympathetic nervous system is where we seem to heal the best. That, and when we're sleeping restfully, in a settled nervous system. It's so many of us are walking around with either hyper aroused kind of fight or flight stress responses in our nervous system, or hypo aroused kind of dorsal vagal, disembodied, disconnected, dissociative aspect of the parasympathetic system. So a lot of this book is about how to restore that ventral vagal aspect of the nervous system so that the body can leverage those self-healing mechanisms that we all have to heal ourselves. And then, of course, the last chapter is also looking at the collective healing and collective trauma, those things that are maybe outside of our individual nervous system, but maybe more in our collective nervous system that sort of has to be addressed at the policy level. So it's no small thing to look at healing, especially in times like this.
Yeah, that was all beautifully said. That was my favorite thing. One of my favorite things about this book was I didn't know what to expect. I had read Mind Over Medicine, but I didn't know what direction this was going to go. And I went into it going, I hope she addresses trauma. And then it was like the entire book had this thread to the nervous system and trauma.
That was not my intention going in.
Not by intention. It's what you found.
Yeah, it's what I found.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what I found when I was working with these sort of indigenous healers and energy healers and faith healers. I was realizing like, wow, they're actually doing what doctors rarely do. They're actually creating a container where traumas are arising, but they're not necessarily trained therapists. They don't necessarily know how to safely work with that trauma. So that's when I heard about an energy healer who was also a trauma therapist who was using trauma therapy to treat cancer. I was like, oh my God, that was like the missing link.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started reverse engineering that, going back into these cutting edge trauma therapies that are rarely taught in graduate schools for people graduating with master's or PhD level, degrees in psychology or marriage and family therapy or whatever. I started asking them, hey, what do you notice if you're treating traumas with these cutting edge trauma therapies? What do you notice with your people that are chronically ill? And they're like, yeah, it's so weird. Like their chronic Lyme disease went away after we treated their traumas, or their chronic pain syndrome. They're no longer on any of their narcotics, or they had cancer and then they had a remission. And then their cancer came back and we started working on their traumas and now they've been in remission for 10 years. And so I started getting very intentional about kind of reverse engineering that, which was not what I expected. I was sort of following the threads of where this journey was leading me. And that was an unexpected U-turn or an unexpected, I'm blanking on the word that I'm trying to find, but it was
it revealed itself to you.
Going stupid right now, but like trailheads or like breadcrumbs. That's kind of what I'm thinking of. I was sort of following the breadcrumbs and all of a sudden they did a 180-degree turn. And I was like, okay, and we're going here. But a lot of the journey was that way. It was very much kind of a guided, unplanned, unexpected, in the flow journey. So that was a surprise, but it was a welcome surprise.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. I'm an anthropologist. I studied anthropology in graduate school. I have a master's in public health and maternal, child, and infant health and global health. And I, from a very young age, 18 in university, I was studying healing systems in different parts of the world. And even before I had any training in biomedicine and public health realms, it was very clear to me that we needed healthy social systems for healing to occur. Because as you mentioned, in shamanistic cultures and in healing ceremonies, healing rites all over the world, the shaman isn't just treating the individual, they're treating the collective. They're pulling stories out. There's, if there's an argument amongst a couple of people that's navigated in a social space in a way that it's not, no, we just end relationships, right? We just ghost people.
Right.
And that does not create conditions for healing. And we have, the number doubles every 10 years in that big study of people that have no one to talk to. And then we wonder why everyone's falling apart in the West and ill and has all these chronic illnesses. And there's been anthropologists who have spent a lot of time studying just the role of social support alone in heart outcomes, heart disease outcomes, and socioeconomic status and the impact on heart disease. Like you can eliminate smoking, you can eliminate all these other things, and socioeconomic status alone will determine someone's health outcome.
Yeah, I did a whole TED Talk called The #1 Public Health Epidemic Doctors Aren't Talking About all of the science between linking loneliness and disease versus community support and healing. And there's a whole chapter in Mind Over Medicine about that, including the story of Rosetta, Pennsylvania, that I'm sure you're familiar with, about this community of Italian immigrants where they had half of the rate of heart disease of the rest of the United States, even though they're eating pizza and pasta and they're drinking their red wine, they're smokers and they're, doing this hard physical labor in the rock quarry, and the women are working in the blouse factory. And it was in many ways kind of an underprivileged community. And a whole team of researchers went in to study them to try to figure out why they had such a low rate of heart disease, given especially their poor diet. And, after looking at everything, is it the water? Is it their medical care? Is it, they essentially concluded that people were not dying of heart disease because nobody was ever lonely. They lived in these multi-generational homes. They had a tremendous network of social support. Nobody was feeling the kind of pressure that like a single mom in the US would tend to face, where you're trying to make the money, do the childcare, get your self-care needs met, take care of your social needs or your dating needs or whatever. And, they had entire support systems. Everybody would make their communal dinners at night. People would come home from their jobs. The kids would play in the street. The elders would be playing their checkers, and they would have their religious ceremonies and all of these networks of support. And sadly, that story has a sad ending, because as the children grew up and wanted to kind of follow the American dream and left the community and went into the suburbs and disconnected from all of that support, the rate of heart disease in those populations went back to the national norm. And we have a lot of other data on that as well. And that was actually one of the inspirations for this book and that TED Talk originally, and for my nonprofit Heal at Last, was the conversations that I was having with my mentor, Rachel Naomi Remen, who wrote the book Kitchen Table Wisdom. And one of her students in our Sangha of doctors was Vivek Murthy, who's our current Surgeon General, was also the Surgeon General under Obama. And we were, Rachel was talking to Vivek about, looking at loneliness as a public health epidemic, something that we should be looking at the level of the Surgeon General, at the level of, public health. And of course, now we have COVID, where the public health officials are literally, following public health guidelines means not getting our loneliness needs attended to. And so the problem became, at the most ridiculous degree, Vivek Murthy's book called Together, about the science of loneliness and the public health epidemic of loneliness, came out in March of 2020. So, these competing needs in the systems of public health, I think now we're seeing some of the aftermath of that in the epidemics of mental health that are the result of, all of this social isolation. So I agree that these are really important things we can't separate. And one of the things that I think that most of the chapter that I originally wrote in the first draft, this book was like 3 books worth of words in its original draft. But I wrote in the original almost an entire chapter about the placebo effect and how it relates to community connection, and the possibility that things like healings that happen at pilgrimage sites like Lourdes, for example, may give us clues to why, HIPAA and privacy in American healthcare systems, for example, where we separate people who are sick and we put them in private one-on-one sessions with their healthcare providers and we isolate them from one another, may be the exact opposite of what we should be doing, that we might be better off actually putting people who are on a healing journey together in safe, sacred spaces of community healing with facilitation, in order to address the isolation that comes with chronic illness for many people, and give them that love and connection and social support at the same time as we're giving them whatever medicines we need to be giving them. And that's the opposite of how our, aside from the occasional like breast cancer support group or something, that's the opposite of how our healthcare systems are designed.
Yeah. My chiropractor treats multiple people in the room all at once. There's always 3 other people in there. He's not a classical chiropractor anymore. He does other techniques. He doesn't actually do any popping and cracking anymore. He does spinal entrainment and cranial sacral and different things, but there's always 2 other people in the room being treated at the same time. And
that's how so many indigenous healers that I work with in this book treat people. And I was so startled by that because, like, you go, for example, to the Balinese healer and you're there waiting in the shala while the healer is meditating to prepare for the healing sessions. And you're there with like 30 other people just kind of waiting your turn. And the healings are happening in front of everybody, which also means that they're talking to you about these super vulnerable things that, you might prefer to keep private, and there's not a lot of privacy. And so I'm sure there's pluses and minuses to both kinds of systems. Like I saw one Qigong master who was working with this young woman, and she was in front of her mother and her father, and she was saying, "Oh, your illness is because you've had 4 abortions." And they didn't know she had had 4 abortions. And so it's kind of like, all right, privacy is sometimes a great thing, but then community healing is also a great thing. So I'm sure there's, trade-offs on both sides between doing these healings in a community setting and sort of the HIPAA rules of privacy.
Right. Well, and because in smaller bands of people, where a lot of, like the Gurung and different groups of people that have these shamanic ceremonies, if you only have 150 people in a housing area, they already know everyone's business. So there's nothing being exposed in a community healing situation, right?
Yeah.
Where now you have, a Westerner attending a Qigong ceremony and, or whatever's happening. It's a bit different, right? Because you don't know the people in the space. Where when you go to a shamanic healing in your village, you know everyone and you already know their business.
That's right. That's a good point.
Right. So it's a bit different experience. I was uncomfortable when his name is Dr. Scott Lampshire, and he's wonderful. I've seen him since I was 12. And I'm 40 now. And when he started doing the group healings, having multiple people in there, it was a really interesting experience because I wasn't expecting that. And I was uncomfortable with it the first few times I went, and now I have no problem with it. I enjoy the shared energy in the room and feeling the support of other people there that are also receiving healing. I've been in there with my dad at the same time, actually, because we're both treated by the same doctor, and that's been quite cool.
Yeah, well, I have a whole chapter in Sacred Medicine about my pilgrimage to Lourdes.
That was my favorite story in the book, by the way.
It was such an unexpected... I was
just weeping while I was reading it. It's beautiful.
I was weeping most of the time I was there. I was such an unexpectedly moving experience for me. And it gave me a huge piece for, the arc of this journey. Because again, I can't imagine going to Lourdes and having it be empty, right? Like if I were to have gone to Lourdes and the same healing grotto is there and the same water is there and the same place where I could process around the field, right? But is it really the sacred water? Is it really the grotto where the Virgin Mary apparently made her appearance? I was just so moved by the vulnerability and humility of the people that had come from all over the world, some of them very sick, many of them terminally ill, in wheelchairs, and so moved by these sort of Lourdes angels who are picking them up at the train stations and pushing them around in their wheelchairs and helping them get to their hotels and facilitating them through the various stations of healing that you can go through at Lourdes. And then the processionals at sunset, and like a number of the people that go there aren't sick. They're there as healers, as part of their spiritual practice, to support the people who are sick. And the whole community experience was just absolutely heart-opening and beautiful. And I think is a huge part of it. And that's what really inspired me to be like, why aren't we doing this more? Like, do we have to go to France to create, or to Mecca, or to these, particular sacred sites? Is it something about the vibration or the frequency of these, some of the people that talk about these sacred places on earth say they're at these kind of acupuncture points on the earth body, and that there's a certain, energetic field in these places. But is that something we can recreate? Like, can we can we recreate these communities of healing in the Western world where we may not have such easy access to that outside of an indigenous community? That's part of what inspired me to start the nonprofit Heal At Last that I'm actively working on now.
Yeah. I think you absolutely can recreate it. I think you probably agree with me from what I've read. I mean, I've seen it in communities. I work with a therapist in our yoga teacher trainings, and people like get over asthma and bowel issues and all kinds of things by the end of the teacher training, just from going through this emotional healing with her that she guides them through, of facing hard feelings that have been eating them from the inside out. You know, you spoke about going back to your creativity, like the Chinese and the traditional Chinese medicine system say when you're very, very ill, that you should return to your lunar nature, to your first self, to your creative gifts. Paint. You have cancer, paint. Make music. Yes. And I don't think any of that can be underestimated. And the feeling of isolation when you're unwell makes everything worse. I mentioned to you that I've had an injury in my neck, and having to be in my room resting instead of in my yoga community and out in my communal space, like all of my suffering amplified. And I had to make myself get out of bed and call my friends and say, I need you to come over and sit with me. And I started to get better, just because I needed the anchoring and community support. And it was interesting. About a week ago, I went to see a new physical therapist, and I'm always still shocked how many doctors are not trauma aware.
Yeah.
It seems like
I'm
that should be
trying to change that.
Right. I know you are. Doctors. That's part of your work.
I'm actively trying to support the awareness of trauma-informed medicine and hopefully moving the needle a little bit at least.
I think you are, but it's shocking to me how many people still don't have any awareness that there is a mind-body connection, an emotional, physical connection. So I went to see a new physical therapist for my neck. And we sat down and I was giving her my history, and I said, you need to know I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder and I'm in trauma therapy. So my nervous system is pretty deregulated. So you need to go in gently with any kind of physical intervention.
Good for you.
She told me to calm down. She said, she goes, well, then all you need to do is calm down. It'll help your neck relax. She was like, you should take deep breaths and you should remove yourself from stressful situations. And I knew, I stayed for the rest of the appointment, but I left and I was like, I won't see her again.
Because I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. I saw someone different today and she was wonderful. It was the exact opposite experience. She was like, so your nervous system's hyper aroused. We need to be really careful today.
Great. That's great.
Right. But it was in the same clinic.
Right.
Different doctor. So I think it's so important, the work that you're doing to educate physicians about the mind-body connections. And I know not everyone can go to school to be a therapist and be an MD. So how do you deal with that as a doctor?
Well, it's tricky because in the Whole Health Medicine Institute, for example, we've been 10 years now teaching doctors how about the mind-body connection, about trauma-informed medicine, about spiritual healing and embodiment and all of these different ways of facilitating healing in our patients. And they don't have time is one of the most difficult things to practice in a trauma-informed way. Almost by definition means you can't be rushed, right? Yeah. If you're rushing someone I used to be a gynecologist. If you're rushing someone into a speculum exam, that is traumatic. Right. So even much less being able to talk to somebody about, is there a history of sexual trauma? Is there anything that's happened in childhood that could impact what's going on in the body now? And, we don't have an hour of therapy time the way a therapist might, for example. But we certainly try to give physicians who are in the system, who are, at the mercy of these very difficult, 40 patients a day kinds of schedules, quick and dirty tips to be more trauma informed. But we also just try to help them open the door and normalize it for our patients and refer out to know how to take a good screening history for adverse childhood experiences, but not just that. One of the things that I think is the most important thing in sacred medicine is giving people awareness of developmental trauma,
Yeah.
Because a lot of people are like, well, I didn't grow up in a war zone. My parents were together. I didn't have child abuse or sexual abuse. I didn't go through any of those horrible things like domestic violence in the home or substance abuse in the home or somebody going to jail in the home. I had sort of a normal childhood. And
Right.
I can't tell you how many people since I published this book have written to me to say, oh my God, page 241 and 242, which is my best attempt to come up with a developmental trauma quiz, because there is not a standardized screening from what I could find of developmental trauma. So I worked with some cutting edge trauma therapists to try to come up with a screening tool of 21 questions. And people just are in tears reading these questions because they're like, oh my God, I didn't know that was a trauma. Like, wow, those 21 questions, I answered yes to 17 of them. And my ACE score is 1. So I think a lot of people don't realize the trauma burden that they carry. And, the field of traumatology is changing so quickly now, but we're coming to realize that developmental trauma, because it is so pervasive and tends to happen throughout childhood, it's not just an event, can be far more devastating to the nervous system and the development of normal nervous system regulation than even some of the severe adverse childhood experiences. And that some of the things that didn't happen in childhood can impact us more severely than the things that did.
Right.
So, I can read a few of these
Please
if you want me to.
I thought that was actually the very next thing I was going to ask you about, and you got to it before I had a chance to ask was, this recognition that so many people have trauma and don't know it. And then they don't understand why they're dealing with all these autoimmune things. And, and I can see where I already knew I had trauma, but you read this list and to be able to identify yourself in a page and recognize you're not alone, recognize that it's common, recognize that there's an answer. Like, I already knew that stuff and I still cried when I read this chapter because
that's why
it was sweet though. It was just like, I'm not alone. This is so common.
Yeah.
Please
I hope
read
to
the ones
normalize it that way.
That are helpful
and also
to
just
you.
to give the trigger alert, like this can be, people can be really moved by this in a way that feels like relief, but it can also just be sad and hard to hear for some people. So I just want to warn people and normalize it. I appreciate that Buddhist psychiatrist Mark Epstein calls it the trauma of everyday life.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those people. I have an ACE score of 0, but I answered yes to a lot of these questions. And I couldn't figure out why life was so hard. And especially in my case, why relationships were so hard. And so it was really, really helpful for me when I got into the best trauma therapy of my life to actually make sense of it and to be able to normalize some of the traumas that I went through and to feel a sense of agency. Like, now my life and the difficult things in my adult life make more sense. And now that I understand how this happened, I can change this. There's something I can do. So it felt very empowering to me at the same time as it was devastating.
Yeah, it's both of those.
Yeah.
I'm the same. My parents are incredible. I love them so much. I didn't have those big traumatic events as a child, but I also still have trauma. And I was always like, well, there's nothing wrong with me. So I don't have a right to feel this way was part of my issue. Like straight up, I was like, you don't have a right to be this upset. And I didn't understand why I was struggling so much. And finding yourself in these things and like mapping yourself in this is so freeing.
Absolutely. And I would call out especially one particular developmental trauma that's defined really well in the neuroaffective relational model, which I mentioned, NARM, in sacred medicine. They talk about the trauma of not having a healthy connection with the mother the birth mother in the first year of life. And that can happen for any number of reasons. It can happen because the baby is born premature and is in an incubator. It can be because the birth mother is sick and separated from the baby after childbirth. It can be because the baby is birthed by a surrogate and is separated from the birth mother because they're given to an adoptive parent. It can be because the birth mother is psychologically checked out from postpartum depression or some other mental illness. It can be any number of reasons that are not necessarily anybody's fault. And that can be one of the most severe traumas for the developing nervous system, because that first year of life, that healthy symbiosis where there's no boundary between the birth mother and the baby. And even just working mothers, like I was separated from my baby at 4 weeks old. This is why as a doctor, I was expected to go back to work 4 weeks after a C-section, even though we told our patients they had to take 12 weeks off.
Yeah.
And this is why I quit. I left medicine because I was like, oh my gosh, I am developmentally traumatizing my baby.
Well, even the way we
working.
birth babies, we cut the umbilical cord way earlier than everyone else in the world does. Like Nepal, they leave the cord attached for 12 to 15 minutes. And there's places where it's even longer than that. They don't cut the cord and take the baby away. Like even that, and we don't have a medical reason why we do a lot of the things we do in birthing. And it's traumatic. Yeah, we traumatize straight out of the womb, cut the cord, take the baby away. How is that the appropriate thing?
Yeah, but those people, this is particularly relevant to the medical illness piece, because those people that fail to get that first year of life connection need met are at significantly higher risk of chronic illness in adulthood, especially those kind of mystery illnesses. And interestingly, they also tend to develop kind of spiritual gifts because they don't fully embody. It's we require that physical touch and co-regulation with the birth mother in order to fully embody. And so, those people are at higher risk of being sort of more disembodied, which gives them kind of access to multidimensional realms. And they may be sort of more likely to have some of those kind of spiritual gifts, but then to have more physical problems and more difficulty with disembodiment and dissociation, ADHD, learning disabilities, some of the other illnesses that can kind of come on those spectrums of difficult to treat with conventional medical treatment.
And that's part of the issue. To speak to your chapter on abuse and whatnot in sacred medicine, those are the types of people that may end up being accidentally an abusive spiritual teacher.
Absolutely.
Right? You have all these incredible gifts, and then your trauma hasn't been healed. And then you are, you're not answering to anyone. There's no accountability, and things spin out of control.
That's right. I want to talk about that, but let me just, since I promised to read a few.
Yeah, we have to back up.
I won't read all 21, but I'll read a few. Did you ever feel that at least one of your parents wasn't capable of connecting with you in a loving and bonding way, leaving you with poor self-esteem, chronic shame, or the feeling that you're somehow damaged? Did you often feel like you could not trust one or both of your parents to attune to you, protect you, and meet your needs? Did you often feel like you had to be the grown-up or caregiver in the family when you were still the child? Did you often feel like one or both of your parents smothered you, engulfed you, dominated you, or wouldn't let you individuate, make your own choices, and become your own person? Did you often feel like you were expected to be a perfect, high-achieving, good girl or boy who made your parents proud, or you'd be severely judged, rejected, punished, shamed, or abandoned? Were you raised without good boundaries or the ability to say no, set limits, or protect yourself? Did you grow up feeling like you were an imposition or a burden to one or both parents? Do you seek out spirituality or have frequent mystical or esoteric out-of-body kinds of experiences? Do you struggle to know what you need or ask others to help you get your needs met? Do you frequently feel overwhelmed, struggle with adult responsibilities, or fixate on your one big problem, assuming that if only it could be solved, everything would be fine? There's lots more, but I just want to, again, normalize, like that was triggering, like just give yourself a moment to sort of hold yourself and acknowledge that these things are not our fault, that it's often not even our parents' fault that developmental trauma becomes a generational wound that is passed down from generation to generation. But we can take responsibility for breaking the chain.
Yes.
And not passing it on to our children. Like sort of, this stops here.
Yes, our ancestry is ours to evolve.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you said, especially that connection, that early connection with the parents, if that need is not met, then it is true that there are often these kind of spiritual gifts that people develop as a coping skill, and that children then grow up, if that wound exists in the system and the nervous system develops very differently, then they often will kind of check out of their body and travel. They may have astral travel. They may have sort of psychic abilities. They may feel visitations by other ancestors, or maybe spirit animals or ghosts, or disembodied beings that are often very comforting, sometimes very scary. And, those people often then go on to develop those gifts and sort of to even kind of feel special or chosen. It's both. Often they feel ostracized and shunned because they're so different. And then they also will kind of develop a compensatory, almost narcissistic specialness, or I'm chosen, I'm better than other people because I have these gifts. And that combination of sort of the painful emotions that can come from having not gotten those connection needs met, that can make somebody feel unlovable or worthless or helpless or hopeless or powerless. And then we get this sort of compensatory survival strategy to kind of develop these spiritual gifts to feel better than or special. And we can have a kind of narcissistic injury that leads some of those people to go on to become spiritual teachers or spiritual healers, or to join spiritual communities and to kind of see themselves as like, I'm spiritual and therefore I'm better than somebody who does not identify with that. And the shadow side of that is that I do believe many of these people do have real gifts, including healing gifts. But if they have not actually done the work on the wound, excuse me, then, they may be practicing from the wound. And we see, it was just the whole part 2. There's 3 parts in the book, and part 2 of the book is all about the shadow of sacred medicine, including
I so appreciate
the number
that you
of
spent so much time on that, because
my gosh,
there's a million self-help books. There's a million books about healing modalities, and people aren't talking about spiritual bypassing, and they're not talking about dangerous, unhealed healers. And I want to highlight what you just said, which these aren't bad people. They're wounded,
They're wounded people.
It's easy to demonize them,
Well, because we get angry. Because, I'm angry that John of God is, was out there attracting vulnerable, sick, and traumatized people and developing this whole mob cult for people that were going to Brazil in search of healing. And I do believe that he was facilitating healing, and he's also in jail for life for over 600 sexual abuse allegations. And that we have a right to be angry about that. But it's also, I think, important not to make anybody into a monster that we cast out of the wholeness of humanity, and to have a trauma-informed view of, hurt people.
Right.
And I was very naive going into this. I kind of had this, I don't know. I didn't grow up in that world. And so I think I kind of thought, if you can lay hands on someone and cure their cancer, then you must be Jesus. And Jesus seemed like a pretty nice guy. But I now think that we really need to separate that. Yeah, maybe some people have these spiritual superpowers, and maybe they can cure cancer with their hands. But that has nothing to do with their ethical development, their moral development, their sexual development, their psychological development.
Their character, integrity.
Their character.
Yeah. I think in some ways I grew up in a church, and I grew up in a church that practiced healing and laid on hands. And I saw healings growing up, like absolutely saw healings at church happen on the things that would be called a miracle. And But growing up, my pastor always told us that the gift of healing was independent of the person's character. And that you could, I mean, I was taught that from the time I was young, that someone can be healing, and it doesn't mean that it's like, that they're special or that they're like Jesus or whatever. So, and yet still my neck injury, I was, but also my neck injury happened because I was under the care of an abusive teacher. Like even knowing all of that, I still got lured into a situation with a teacher that was not a good person and has tons of his own trauma and is very much a narcissist and has harmed. Now I know lots of people because I've been having conversations with other men and women that have been harmed by this person. And so it was interesting to me because I should have known, I had the I should have known dialogue. But then again, like now looking at the processing I've been doing, I'm going through a process you described yourself going through in this book of healing trauma. Now I can hold that with a lot of tenderness because I understand why I was attracted to it and what I was trying to play out, what wound I was playing out.
Yeah, I've had the same vulnerability, and it was very traumatic for me going through the 10-year quest of this journey. Not just, I was relatively lucky in that I didn't get directly harmed very much, but I have a lot of bystander trauma, and I've spent a lot of money on therapy from witnessing some of these healers really harming people and feeling quite helpless because, many of them are unregulated. I can't turn them in. If it was a doctor or a therapist, then they could be turned into their board and they could lose their license. But what do you do if, people who, I made the mistake of naming some of these people without discerning them and kind of putting it on Facebook or whatever as I was along the journey. And then some of those people took me naming these people as an endorsement. And then I would get these horrible emails from people saying, well, I went to this shaman and he raped me. And I was just like, oh my God. And I felt like horribly guilty for was I in some way responsible for luring people into an abusive dynamic? And I'm still waiting for a public apology from Oprah. Like she put John of God on the Oprah Winfrey show twice, and publicized this person when at the time there were rampant allegations of abuse that had not yet been convicted. And I'm still waiting for a public apology from her. I have said out loud, like, oh my God, if I have in any way, accidentally harmed somebody because I've mentioned the name of somebody who I did not know that this was happening, then I am so sorry. And I think
had to apologize to some women because they went and studied with this person because they saw me studying with this person and they respected me and they were harmed. And I had to apologize. And I had to apologize. This might be a little triggering for our listeners, so please take note. But I witnessed also some of my trauma from that was bystander trauma of watching things happen. And in the moment, I disassociated and disembodied and didn't act. Like I just sat there frozen while things were happening in front of me. And it wasn't until I had left and been through some trauma therapy around it that I could even acknowledge what I had sat there and witnessed. And I had to make some phone calls to people that I witnessed get abused and apologize for not standing up and defending them, which they understood. They were like, I wouldn't have done anything either, but I was totally disembodied. I was disassociated, when I was watching it happen.
That happened. I'm so sorry that happened. But I can really relate.
But we now get to be, I love this idea that anything we get healing from, we get to become a comforter to others. And you and I, we get to have this conversation right now that's going to be enlightening for someone else. And so, we have to pull the gold out of these things and the healing that can come collectively from processing and having these difficult conversations.
Yeah. And the more we can raise awareness about that and forgive ourselves. I have had to forgive myself for some of the ways in which I was maybe complicit with some of these traumas and times when I didn't speak out. And I've been trying to make that right. For example, I had a lot of bystander trauma when I was with one of my former publishers. And one of the authors that was younger than me, that was a BIPOC woman, was experiencing the impact of a lot of systemic racism in the publishing world. And I had seen all these abuses of power in that world. And I left my publisher and I kept my mouth shut. I didn't speak out about it. I didn't say anything. And then I realized in retrospect, when I heard about the traumas she was going through, that my silence had potentially put her in harm's way. And that if I had been public about why I left that publisher, that perhaps I could have helped protect this vulnerable author who was, like I said, younger and maybe naive and seduced into a cultic publishing company.
Right.
And so I ended up going on the Conspirituality podcast, after she had kind of come out on that podcast to say, I'm so sorry, like my silence might have harmed you. And I wanted to try to have her back and validate her story. And, at the risk of putting myself, in harm's way of, there are powerful organizations out there that don't want to be outed. And I still have there are 30 famous people whose careers I could ruin by naming them out loud. But I honestly don't know what to do with it. I've been talking to investigative journalists kind of off the record just to say, here, if you want the story, go investigate these people, because if it had happened to me directly, then I could have gone to those investigative journalists directly and said, here's my story about this, new age spiritual teacher or whatever.
Right. Well, and you don't want to become the target of violence because of it. Like in my situation, these people now live near me and I wouldn't feel safe. And even though there's a whole bunch of people, like 20 plus people that have said they would be willing to also speak out that found me, I didn't find them. I'm the most articulate of the bunch and the one with the advanced degrees and blah, blah, blah. And I know I would end up at the center of it and I'm exhausted. I don't want to. I just finished processing it and getting enough space from it to be free. And the thought of having to be the face of it, but then I carry around this guilt of it's continuing to happen and people are going to continue to get harmed. And there's so many of us that have all been unwilling to stand up and speak. And sometimes I don't know what to do with that.
I understand that feeling of helplessness. I'm really grateful. There's such a public dialogue going on right now with I'm listening to all of the A Little Bit Culty podcasts from the Sarah and Nippy who, came out, were the whistleblowers for the NXIVM cult. And I love Rachel Bernstein's Indoctrination.
Yep. It's a great resource.
I've been listening to the Conspirituality podcast. I recommend listening to these things just as a way to educate yourself about how to spot, coercive control and narcissistic abuse and cultic dynamics in groups and just learning how to protect ourselves with the psychoeducation and the awareness so that we can do better about that. And it's been very helpful for me also because I'm in a position of power. And the last thing I want to do is, I'm especially because of the Heal at Last group healing circles I'm trying to create through the nonprofit world. I want to make sure we cult-proof those communities from the get-go.
Right.
Because the last thing I want to do is join the Lissa Rankin cult.
Right.
I want to protect myself from both being victimized by abuses of power and I also want to protect myself from recommending anybody who's abusing power or from being somebody who abuses power.
Right. So I'm a yoga teacher and I teach communities and I have students. And when I look back, and I wasn't outright ever trying to harm anyone, and I don't think there's anyone who would say that I did, but I look back at some of my behavior before I had gone through therapy when I was leading. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, just ways that I interacted with people that was not trauma informed, arguing with students, stuff that is so embarrassing to me now, 15 years later, and I'm going through all this education around being a better trauma informed teacher. And I watch as I heal how much of a safer space I hold for people. And, all I can do is apologize where it's needed and go forward, leave the mistakes in the past and love forward and not get into shame about it. But it's such an important dialogue. And I do want to highlight too, that you did make a wonderful list in Sacred Medicine about how to identify potentially harmful teachers.
Yeah. I hope part of this book was to try to teach safety So we can take responsibility for protecting ourselves rather than just expecting. Not all of the healers and leaders out there are aware of these dynamics, and they may be sort of operating from the wound. And so we have to take, again, it's not to let them off the hook of accountability, but to take responsibility for trying to improve our discernment and keep ourselves as safe as we can.
Yes. I know I can't keep you much longer, but do you have a minute to discuss spiritual bypassing?
I literally have a minute.
1 minute.
Because I have another appointment.
Summarize your 1 minute for me.
Well, I was going to say there's a whole chapter on spiritual bypassing, but in short, spiritual bypassing is the usage of spiritual practices and tools to avoid touching our trauma. Often in sort of conflict avoidant ways. And it can really, it's not a benign thing. I mean, I look back at my own spiritual bypassing parts that, it was quite an ecstatic time. I went through a phase, especially early in this journey, where it was quite fun to just hop from one ecstatic dance to the next sort of tantra workshop, to the next kirtan, to the next yoga workshop. And, it's very, very blissful in many ways. However, it was also true that I was getting a hit of endorphins and, these kind of these healing hormones that we can actually get through some of these spiritual practices. But I was getting addicted to it in a way that made me dependent on the next hit because it was not actually touching my real pain. And I had just come out of a series of back-to-back traumas after I left the hospital. And so what I hadn't really realized is that not only is the spiritual bypassing putting us at risk of disease, but it's also grooming us for abuse, grooming us to tolerate abusive relationships, abusive spiritual teachers that, I wrote an article that you guys can Google if you want called 10 Ways to Oppress People with Spirituality. And one of the ways is, for example, demonize people's anger, like encourage toxic positivity, like basically tell people to get out of their victim story. There's a whole, like I said, I put a great deal of attention into the chapter about spiritual bypassing because I think it's so important for us to be able to spot those tendencies. I'll see quickly if I can just find a couple of the things that we can look for, because typically abusive leaders are actually teaching spiritual bypassing.
Right.
And then they actually use what they're teaching to, to harm people. So it's very twisted. So for example, aversion to any emotion not deemed spiritual, anger phobia that resists calling for a clear and firm intolerance of hurtful behavior, difficulty expressing a firm and clear no, toxic positivity to the point of fakeness in situations where grief, anger, sadness, jealousy, or disappointment would be natural, premature forgiveness rather than expecting others to be held accountable for harmful behaviors with a healthy process of making apologies, amends, or other measures to ensure that harmful behavior ceases, exaggerated tolerance of abusive people and behaviors, weak or porous boundaries, spiritualizing boundarylessness, mistaking unhealthy fusion as a mystical experience, excessive niceness to the point of being unable to take a firm stand or protect oneself from abusive relationships, trouble staying firmly grounded in earthly realities and tending to prefer mystical experiences like meditation, astral travel, spirit guides, channeled beings, medicine journeys, etc. There's a whole bunch of them, but
so
those
good.
are just...
You just said exactly what I wanted you to say. I was like, I just want us to touch on this because we mentioned abusive teachers and this connection and anyone who's... What I loved, the last thing I want to say, what I loved that you said about the bypassing thing though, is that we can go get a little hit to get to a level where we can cope and then go pursue our deep dive healing, trauma therapy and whatnot. And along the way, keep giving ourselves that little infusion to support us on our way.
Yeah, well, now I practice spiritual bypassing intentionally. Sometimes if I'm really anemic on life force, I'm like, I need a transfusion. I need to bolus myself. I'm in trauma therapy twice a week. because I'm in couples therapy with my partner and I'm in therapy for myself in IFS. So I'm doing my trauma work. I do my IFS meditation every morning. And like when Roe versus Wade got overturned, I'm like, oh my God, I need a bolus. I need to uplift myself right now because this is so traumatic. And so I think, part of how I wrote Sacred Medicine is like, here are the tools you can use to bolus yourself with a transfusion of energy. And here are the trauma healing tools that we can use. And we need to just be able to, based on our resilience and our resourcing, know when to transfuse ourselves and when to do the deeper dive. As long as we're not skipping that, I don't think there's anything wrong with using those spiritual practices. I love my yoga practice. I love chanting and singing. I love hiking out in nature. I love, participating in indigenous nature rituals and healing journeys and sacred pilgrimages and things like that. I just got back from going to Yosemite, which is always like going to church for me. So we need both.
Thank you so much. That was exactly what I wanted you to cover quickly because, we're talking about the negative side and we need to reinforce, but also these things are available to you. You can find the book anywhere. I don't want to keep you anymore. We went 4 minutes over. Sacred Medicine. The book is available at all major bookstores and retailers and online. Thank you so much for your time. It was
such a pleasure.
Such a delightful conversation. It was such an honor.
Rich dialogue.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to anybody who's listening. Even just some of this can be triggering for people listening. And I just want to give a big hug and shout out to anybody who's kind of brave enough to stay with us in these conversations. And just another reminder to be really gentle with ourselves. We can't do better until we know better. And we're all learning together.
Yes, we're doing the best we can with the information we have.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.